Good afternoon and welcome again. In this lecture we're going to have our brief overview of Photoshop and how the 2D textures are working. So these will be the textures which will be wrapping around the models to provide them their colour. And because I've gone for a low poly art style, there's no shading that's needed or detail of the models, which means we can use flat colours to give the models their coloured appearance. Now, there's a couple of ways we could have done this. I could have mapped everything when I was talking about the UV mapping previously. I could have given certain sections a unique material, and then you can change the colour of the material inside of the Unreal Engine. And now that's fine sometimes, probably not so much, just because what that means that you end up doing is that if we remember that the ship had 3 different colours, so that would have needed a material for the black, the grey and the blue for the enemy ship, for example. That's 3 materials then just for one ship. You'd also need 3 materials possibly for the player ship, and then you'd keep doing that for all of the models in the game. And you can see quite quickly that you're getting to high numbers of materials just for a couple of different objects. Whereas the way that I've set this up, we're actually going to have 3 materials for the entire game. So every asset that we have in the project will be able to work from 3 different materials, which I think is quite impressive. I think that is a really efficient way to approach getting the assets into the game, because the way that it works whilst you're processing or running the game is one of the things you need to focus on is keeping the drill calls down. And drill calls are affected by things like the number of materials and objects and different things that need to be drawn each frame of the game or drill call. So it's very important to try and find ways to minimize the amount of processes which are being sent through that. So the way that I've done it is, you've already seen whilst we're looking at our introduction in Blender that the UV maps will put certain parts of the model and map them to different sections in these textures. And what that means is, as long as I'm using the same texture size for most of the models, they can all be mapped onto the same texture. And all we need to do then to change the style or colouring of them is simply change the colour of the square that we're interested in. So all this is a simple square texture. It's 128 pixels by 128 pixels split into 4. So we simply have 4 squares of 64 by 64 pixels. And then this way, for instance, with the player, so the player is going to have an orange carapace type thing. It's got the black body and the grey connecting section. So if we wanted it to have a green carapace instead, all we would need to do is simply come over here, select our colour, and we just colour that section in green. Need to turn the tolerance down so it doesn't overlap, and turn the anti-aliasing off. There we go. So now if we re-import this into the game, that would allow us to have a completely different colour for the player object. And it's really as simple as that. So I think that's going to be a really useful aspect of this. Now again, I think at the moment it's probably sounding a bit vague, and I'm aware of that, and I do want to demo this, and I will be coming back to this in a later lecture. And when we actually know what the materials are and how we're using them in the game, I'm going to give some extra demonstrations on how we can swap these in and out and how reusable they are. But I really just wanted to very quickly run through the other bits of software that I've been using to create these pipelines, and just to demonstrate how simple it was to do it. So one thing to kind of get across in this is, if you wanted to add in a whole new texture and then reference that later with your own texture, all you need to do is, if you press Ctrl and N in Photoshop, make sure that you set your width to 128 by 128 for the new texture. And then if you make a square of 64 by 64, easiest way to do this will just be to grab one of my squares, Control C and Control V that in, and just line that in the top corner. And just start choosing the colours that you want these to be. And again, line that up. And what you have here now is, very quickly, we've got a number of different squares which are all different colours again, and this would give you a whole new layout of the way that the mapping to the ships are being performed in the game. So that's how you can make your own texture if you wanted some. I apologise for how horrible these colours are. I'm sort of noticing them in the background though. Go back to this. But that's how simple it is to make another texture on the setup that I've provided for the assets in this game. And again, as I said, this will all start to make a bit more sense, I think, as we start using it and as you start seeing how easy it is to change them. But for now, that was the very brief introduction to Photoshop I wanted to go through. We will come back and focus a bit more on the art side of things later when we've started seeing how they interact with the Unreal Engine. So this wraps up our assets section of the course. We now have a slight understanding of where the models have came from. The assets have been modelled through Blender. There are plenty of other 3D packages out there, such as Maya, 3ds Max, Cinema 4D, Modo and things like that, where you could also model them. So you need those to be modelled first. And then the way that we're applying the style and the colour to them is through something called a texture. The texture is just a 2D image. The image is fairly arbitrary, but they tend to work better in 120 in multiples of something like 64, so 32 by 32, 64 by 64, 128 by 128 and so on. So you get these square textures. So we now have an understanding at least of what these terminologies are. Just to recap on UV mapping as well, so the UVs are the points and the edges on the model and they will be mapped to the texture. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense now as well. Now that we've got the texture, we know that in Blender we saw the UV mapping was being applied to the different portions of them, which then transferred the coloured information across as well. And in the engine, the UV mapping is also important for making sure that the lighting and reflections and shadows and things interact properly with the model and certain points. So I'll leave that there for the asset section, and I will see you in the next lecture.